The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 1881, carried by the stagecoach that rattled into Animas Forks, Colorado, 3 times a week. And Harriet Lane stood behind the counter of the general store watching through the dusty window as the driver tossed a mail sack to the ground with the casual indifference of a man who had made this journey 1,000 times before. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric worn thin from years of use, and felt her heart quicken with a familiar mixture of hope and dread. Letters from the East meant news from home, from the family she had left behind in Boston 2 years ago when she had accompanied her uncle to this remote mining town nestled high in the San Juan Mountains, where the air was thin and the winters brutal, and the summer wildflowers bloomed with such fierce beauty it could make a person weep. Her uncle, Samuel Brennan, had come to Animas Forks with dreams of striking silver, like so many men who flooded into Colorado in those years when the earth seemed to promise wealth to anyone brave or foolish enough to dig deep enough. The town itself perched at an elevation of over 11,000 feet, surrounded by jagged peaks that scraped the sky, and in winter the snow could bury buildings up to their roofs. It was a hard place, populated mostly by miners and the merchants who served them, and Harriet had learned quickly that survival here required a kind of toughness she had never needed in the comfortable brownstone where she had grown up, the youngest daughter of a shipping merchant who had died when she was 16, leaving debts that scattered the family like seeds in the wind. When her uncle had offered her a position helping run his store, she had accepted not out of any pioneering spirit, but out of simple necessity. At 23, she was considered nearly a spinster by Boston standards, and her prospects for a good marriage had dimmed considerably after her father's bankruptcy. So she had packed her trunks, said goodbye to her mother and 2 sisters, and boarded a train that carried her across the vast expanse of the country, through landscapes that seemed to stretch forever, until she arrived in this town that clung to the mountainside like a barnacle to a ship's hull. The store was her domain now. Her uncle spent most of his time at his claim, digging into the mountain with the desperate energy of a man who believed his fortune was always just 1 more foot deeper. And Harriet managed the inventory, kept the books, and served the customers who came through the door looking for everything from pickaxes to preserved peaches. She had grown accustomed to the rough manners of the miners, the way they tracked mud across her swept floors and spoke in voices loud enough to shake the rafters, and she had earned their respect through sheer competence, and a sharp tongue that could cut a man down to size if he got too familiar. The mailbag sat in front of the post office, which occupied a corner of the store, and Harriet moved toward it with practiced efficiency. She sorted through the letters and packages, her fingers moving quickly as she organized them by name. Most were for the miners, letters from wives and mothers and sweethearts back east, and she set them aside in the proper cubbyholes that lined the wall behind the counter. There was a package for Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, and 3 letters for the marshal, and then her hand stilled on an envelope addressed in her mother's elegant script. She tucked the letter into her pocket, knowing she would read it later in the privacy of her room above the store, and continued sorting until she reached the bottom of the bag. There were 2 letters addressed to Harrison Lang, and she paused, frowning slightly. She knew Harrison, of course. Everyone in Animas Forks knew everyone else by necessity, if not by choice. He worked as a ranch hand for the McAllister spread, one of the few cattle operations that managed to eke out an existence in the high country during the brief summer months when grass grew thick enough to feed livestock. He was a quiet man, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and hands that bore the scars of hard work, and he came into the store perhaps once a month to purchase tobacco and coffee and other necessities. Harriet had noticed him, the way any woman would notice a man like that, with his steady gray eyes, and the way he moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his body. But he never lingered to talk, never showed any interest in anything beyond his purchases, and she had filed him away in her mind as just another face in a town full of transient men. The letters were from different addresses, both somewhere in Kansas, and they had been sitting in the cubbyholes for weeks now, maybe months. She made a mental note to mention it to him the next time he came in, then finished sorting the mail and turned her attention to the ledgers that needed updating. 3 days later, Harrison Lang pushed through the door of the general store just as the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the windows in long golden bars. Harriet looked up from where she was restocking a shelf with canned goods and felt a small flutter in her chest that she firmly suppressed. He removed his hat as he entered, a gesture of courtesy that many of the miners had forgotten or never learned, and approached the counter with the economical movements of a man who wasted no energy. "Afternoon," he said, his voice low and pleasant despite its rough edges. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lang," Harriet replied, wiping her hands on her apron and moving behind the counter. "What can I help you with today? Need tobacco and some rifle cartridges if you have them." She nodded and turned to gather the items, acutely aware of his presence behind her. When she placed them on the counter, she remembered the letters and retrieved them from the cubbyhole. "These came for you," she said, holding them out. "The first one arrived about 6 weeks ago, I believe." Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to identify, and he took the letters from her with a slight nod. He stared down at them for a long moment, and Harriet saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Then he folded them carefully and tucked them into his shirt pocket without opening them. "That will be $1.50 for the tobacco and cartridges," she said. He paid, counted out the coins with deliberate care, and gathered his purchases. But he hesitated before turning to leave, and Harriet saw him glance toward the letters in his pocket with an expression that looked almost like grief. "Is everything all right?" she asked before she could stop herself. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable there, something that made him seem younger than his 27 or 28 years. "Fine," he said. "Just been a while since I heard from my sister. I hope she is well. I expect so." He settled his hat back on his head and touched the brim in farewell. "Good day, Miss Brennan." She watched him leave, watched the way he moved through the door and into the street where the afternoon sun turned everything golden and sharp-edged, and she wondered about those letters and why he had looked at them with such a strange mixture of longing and despair. Over the following weeks, as September gave way to October and the aspens turned brilliant gold on the mountainsides, Harriet found herself thinking about Harrison Lang more than she should have. He returned to the store twice more, and each time there were letters waiting for him, and each time he took them without comment and tucked them away unopened. It became a pattern she began to anticipate, this silent ritual of handing over envelopes that he clearly had no intention of reading, and her curiosity grew into something more insistent. The third time it happened, she could not help herself. "Mr. Lang," she said as he was preparing to leave, the unopened letters once again in his pocket. "Forgive me for asking, but is there some problem with your mail? If the letters are being misaddressed, perhaps I could help sort it out." He stopped, his hand on the door, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned back to face her, and she saw resignation in his eyes. "Letters are addressed right enough," he said quietly. "Just cannot do much with them is all. I do not understand." He was silent for another beat, and then he said with obvious difficulty, "Never learned to read, Miss Brennan. My sister, she writes regular, but I cannot make sense of the words. The confession hung in the air between them, and Harriet felt a rush of understanding, followed immediately by sympathy. Illiteracy was not uncommon, especially among men who had grown up on the frontier where schools were scarce and work was plentiful from an early age, but admitting it required courage. She could see the shame in the set of his shoulders, the way he would not quite meet her eyes. "I see," she said gently. "Would you like me to read them to you?" He looked up sharply, surprise clear on his face. "You would do that, of course." She gestured to the letters in his pocket. "If they are from your sister, you should know what she has to say." For a moment she thought he would refuse, pride warring with need in his expression. But then he reached into his pocket and drew out the 3 letters, the oldest one creased and worn from being carried. He placed them on the counter between them with careful reverence, and Harriet felt the weight of trust in that simple gesture. "Would you prefer privacy?" she asked, glancing toward the empty store. It was late afternoon, and most of the miners were still at their claims or had already retreated to the saloons. "If it is not too much trouble." She flipped the sign on the door to closed and led him to the back room where she kept extra inventory and a small desk where she did the bookkeeping. The space was cramped but private, and she lit the oil lamp against the gathering shadows before settling into the chair behind the desk. Harrison remained standing, his hat in his hands, looking uncertain and vulnerable in a way that made her chest tighten. "Please sit," she said, indicating the stool beside the desk. He sat, and she picked up the oldest letter, the one that had arrived 6 weeks ago, and carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside was covered in a neat, practiced hand, and she began to read. "Dear Harry," she started, and saw him flinch slightly at the nickname. "I hope this letter finds you well and that the work on the ranch is not too hard. Things here in Dodge City are much the same. Michael is growing so fast you would hardly recognize him. He is nearly 6 now and full of questions about his Uncle Harry and when you might come visit." Harriet paused, glancing up to see Harrison's face had gone soft with emotion. She continued reading, the letter full of small domestic details, news about neighbors and weather and the daily rhythms of life in Kansas. His sister, whose name was Martha, wrote about her husband's work at the freight office and the new dress she was making for their daughter. There was love in every line, affection and concern for a brother who had gone west and whom she clearly missed. When Harriet finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Would you like me to read the others?" He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and she opened the second letter, which was similar in tone but included news of Martha's pregnancy, and her hope that Harrison might be able to come home for the birth. The third letter was newer, dated just 3 weeks ago, and it spoke of worry that she had not heard from him and hoped he was all right. "She thinks I am angry with her," Harrison said when Harriet finished, his voice rough. "Or that something has happened. You should write back." He looked down at his hands, those scarred, capable hands that could rope a steer and break a horse and build a fence, but could not form the letters that would ease his sister's worry. "Cannot," he said simply. "You could dictate a letter to me," Harriet offered. "I would be happy to write it for you." He met her eyes then, and she saw gratitude there mixed with something else, something she could not quite name. "That is kind of you, Miss Brennan. Real kind, but I hate being so dependent, feel like a child or a fool." "You are neither," she said firmly. "Plenty of people never had the opportunity to learn. It says nothing about your intelligence or worth." Still, he stood, gathering the letters with gentle hands. "I thank you for reading these. Means more than I can say, but I would not want to impose further." Harriet stood as well, and before she could think better of it, she said, "I could teach you." He stared at her. "What? To read? I could teach you to read and write." The words came out in a rush, surprising her as much as him. It is not so difficult once you understand the basics. You are clearly intelligent, Mr. Lang. I imagine you would pick it up quickly. I could not ask that of you. You are not asking. I am offering. She felt conviction growing as she spoke, a sense of rightness that she had not felt in a long time. I have the evenings free, and Lord knows there is little enough entertainment in Animas Forks. It would give me something useful to do. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face as if trying to determine whether she was serious. Why would you do this? Because everyone deserves to read their own letters, she said simply. Because your sister loves you and you should be able to write back to her in your own hand. And because, she added with a small smile, I was trained as a teacher before I came west and I miss it. This last was true, though she had not thought about it in months. She had attended normal school in Boston, had planned to teach until she married, but those plans had dissolved along with her father's fortune. The prospect of teaching again, even just one student in the back room of a general store, awakened something in her that had been dormant. Harrison was quiet for so long she thought he would refuse, but finally he nodded. All right, he said. If you are willing, I would be grateful to learn. But I insist on paying you. That is not necessary. It is to me. His voice was firm. I work for what I get, Miss Brennan, always have. If you are going to spend your time teaching me, then I will compensate you for it, same as I would pay for any other service. She saw that his pride required this, and she nodded. Very well. Shall we say 3 evenings a week and 50 cents per lesson, $1? That is too much. It is what your time is worth. He held out his hand, and after a moment she shook it, feeling the calluses rough against her palm, the strength in his grip. When do we start? Tomorrow evening, she suggested. After the store closes, say 7 o'clock. I will be here. True to his word, Harrison arrived the next evening at precisely 7 o'clock, cleaned up from the day's work, his hair still damp where he had obviously washed at the pump. Harriet had prepared for the lesson with the same care she would have given a classroom of students back in Boston, gathering paper and pencils, a slate for practicing letters, and a primer she had found among her uncle's stock, probably purchased by some optimistic mother for a child who had since moved on. They sat at the desk in the back room, the oil lamp casting a warm circle of light that seemed to separate them from the dark world outside. Harriet started with the basics, showing him the alphabet, helping him understand how letters formed sounds and sounds formed words. His hands, so sure with a rope or a rifle, were clumsy with the pencil at first, and she saw his frustration as he struggled to make the marks on the paper look like the examples she had written. It takes time, she said gently, when she saw him scowl at his attempts to write the letter A. Your hand needs to learn new movements. Be patient with yourself. Not much good at being patient, he admitted. Then this will be good practice for you in more ways than one. He glanced up at her, and she saw a hint of humor in his eyes. You are a stern teacher, Miss Brennan. Laurel, she said impulsively. If we are going to be spending our evenings together, you might as well call me Laurel. Laurel, he repeated, and something about the way he said her name, careful and deliberate, made warmth spread through her chest. Then you should call me Harrison. Or Harry, which is what my family calls me, though I have not heard it in a long time. Harrison suits you better, I think. Why is that? It is more dignified. You strike me as a dignified person. He laughed at that, a sound that transformed his usually serious face. Never been called dignified before. Most would say stubborn or hard-headed. Those two, perhaps, she said with a smile. Now let us try the letter B. The lessons became a rhythm in her life, a pattern she found herself anticipating with increasing eagerness. Harrison came 3 evenings a week, and they worked by lamplight while the town settled into its nightly routines around them, the sounds of the saloons drifting through the walls, the occasional shout or burst of laughter from the street. He was a dedicated student, approaching the lessons with the same focused intensity he probably brought to breaking horses or mending fences, and she was surprised by how quickly he progressed. Within 2 weeks, he could write his name in awkward but legible letters. Within a month, he was sounding out simple words, his finger moving carefully under each letter as he worked through the primer. She watched his confidence grow with each small success, saw the way his face would light up when he managed to read a complete sentence without help, and she felt a teacher's pride mixed with something deeper, something that had nothing to do with pedagogy and everything to do with the man himself. They talked during the lessons, conversation flowing naturally in the quiet intimacy of the lamplight. He told her about growing up in Kansas, the youngest of 4 children, on a hardscrabble farm where there had been no money for school and every pair of hands was needed to keep the family fed. His father had died when he was 12, kicked by a horse, and his older brother had taken over the farm while Harrison had hired himself out to neighboring ranches, learning the skills that would eventually bring him west. Martha was the only one who learned to read, he explained one evening in late October, when frost was already threatening the high country and the aspens had dropped their leaves, leaving the mountains looking stark and bare. She was clever, and the schoolteacher took a shine to her, taught her extra after hours. She tried to teach me once when I was young, but I was too restless. Could not sit still long enough to make sense of it. Always thought I would learn later, but later never seemed to come. You are learning now, Laurel said. That is what matters, because of you. His eyes met hers across the desk, serious and intent. I want you to know I am grateful, Laurel. This is changing things for me. Not just the reading, but having something to work toward, something that is mine. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked down at the primer to hide her reaction. Over the weeks, her feelings toward Harrison had shifted from friendly interest to something far more complicated. She found herself thinking about him during the day, noticed when he came into the store even when she was busy with other customers, saved up small observations to share with him during their lessons. It was dangerous, she knew, to let herself care for him this way, to let hope kindle when she had come to Animas Forks specifically to avoid the complications of romance. But she could not seem to help herself. The first snow came in early November, a heavy wet snow that blanketed the town and made the rutted streets treacherous. Harriet worried that Harrison would not be able to make it in for his lesson, that the 5 miles between the ranch and town would be impassable. But he arrived right on time, covered in snow and half frozen, stamping his boots in the doorway and shaking the snow from his coat. You should not have come in this weather, she scolded, though secretly she was relieved to see him. Made a commitment, he said simply. Besides, I want to show you something. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, protected from the snow by the layers of fabric. He unfolded it carefully on the desk, smoothing out the creases, and she saw it was covered in writing, the letters uneven but readable, the words spelled out with painstaking care. I wrote to Martha, he said, and there was pride in his voice, quiet but unmistakable. Read it and tell me if it makes sense. Laurel read the letter, her throat tightening as she took in the simple words. He had written about the ranch, about learning to read, about how sorry he was for not writing sooner. He told his sister he missed her and thought about her often, that he hoped to meet the new baby when it came, and that he was grateful for all the letters she had sent over the years, even when he could not read them himself. It was brief and plain, without any literary flourishes, but it was from the heart, and that made it more moving than any eloquent prose. Harrison, she said when she finished, looking up at him. "This is wonderful. She will be so happy to receive this." "You are sure? The spelling is all right." "There are a few small mistakes, but nothing that matters. The meaning is clear, and that is what counts." She handed the letter back to him. "I am proud of you." He folded the letter carefully, his movements precise, and tucked it back into his coat. "Could not have done it without you. You did the work, I just showed you how. It was more than that." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I want you to know what this means to me, Laurel, all of it. The lessons, yes, but also just having someone who believed I could learn, who did not make me feel stupid for not knowing. You are not stupid, you never were. I know that now." He met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Thanks to you." The lessons continued through November and into December, and as Harrison's reading improved, Laurel found herself reluctant for the sessions to end. She began supplementing the primer with other materials. Newspapers and books she ordered specially from Denver, anything to prolong their time together. They read aloud to each other, taking turns with passages from novels and articles about world events, and the conversations that grew from these readings ranged far and wide, touching on philosophy and politics and dreams for the future. She learned that he wanted to have his own ranch someday, not just work for someone else. That he loved the high country despite its harshness, loved the way the land could break a weak man but would sustain a strong one. That he had stayed in Colorado partly because he felt he had something to prove, to himself if to no one else, and partly because he had found a kind of freedom in the West that he had never known in Kansas. In turn, she told him about Boston, about the life she had left behind, about her father's death and the financial ruin that followed, the way her mother had been forced to take in sewing to make ends meet, how her sisters had married quickly, almost desperately, to men who could provide security if not affection. She told him about the teaching career she had planned, cut short by circumstance, and about coming to Animas Forks with equal parts fear and determination. "You regret it?" he asked one evening in mid-December. Outside, the snow was falling again, thick and steady, and she knew they would be snowed in soon. That winter in earnest was coming to the high country. Coming here, I mean. She considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, even 3 months ago, she might have said yes. But now, sitting across from Harrison in the warm circle of lamplight, watching his face as he concentrated on the book open before him, she found she could not regret the choices that had brought her to this moment. "No," she said finally, "I do not regret it. My life is not what I planned, but that does not mean it is a lesser life. Just different. Different can be good," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her think they were no longer just talking about geography. The store did good business in the weeks before Christmas, miners stocking up on supplies before the worst of the winter locked them in, and Laurel was run off her feet during the days. Her uncle had finally given up on his claim and left for Denver, leaving her to manage the store alone until spring, and she was grateful for the lessons with Harrison that gave structure to her evenings, and something to look forward to beyond the endless routine of inventory and sales. Harrison's lessons had progressed to the point where he could read simple books on his own, though he still struggled with complex passages and unfamiliar words. They had moved beyond pure instruction into something more like companionship, reading together not because he needed her help, but because they both enjoyed it. She had started bringing food to share during their sessions, simple suppers of bread and cheese and preserved fruit, and they would eat together while they read, the domestic intimacy of it making her heart ache with unnamed longing. It was during one of these quiet evenings, 3 days before Christmas, that Harrison set down the book he had been reading and looked at her with an expression she could not decipher. "I need to tell you something," he said. Laurel felt her stomach tighten with sudden apprehension. "What is it?" "I have been offered a job, foreman position at a ranch down near Durango. Better pay, my own cabin, chance to run things the way I think they should be run." "That is wonderful," she said, forcing brightness into her voice even as something cold settled in her chest. "You must be pleased." "I am. It is the kind of opportunity I have been working toward." He paused. "But it would mean leaving Animas Forks, leaving the McAllister place, leaving," and here his voice dropped, "leaving you." The admission hung between them, as heavy and significant as any declaration. Laurel felt her pulse hammering in her throat, felt the weight of everything they had not said over these past months pressing down on her. "When would you go?" she managed. "Not until spring. Snow makes travel impossible now, but I wanted you to know. Felt like I owed you that much, after everything you have done for me." "You do not owe me anything, Harrison." "I think we both know that is not entirely true." He reached across the desk and took her hand, his touch careful and warm. "These months, learning to raid, spending time with you, it has meant more to me than just the lessons. I think you know that." She did know it, had felt the same pull, the same growing attachment, but knowing and acknowledging were different things, and she found herself struggling for words. "I care for you, Laurel," he continued when she did not speak. "More than I probably should. More than is maybe wise, given that you are a lady from Boston and I am a ranch hand who just learned to write his own name. But I wanted you to know before I left, because it did not seem right to go without saying it." Laurel's mind was racing. He cared for her. He was leaving. These two facts seemed incompatible, contradictory. "If you care for me," she said slowly, "why are you going?" "Because I have nothing to offer you here. I work for wages, live in a bunkhouse with 5 other men, own nothing but my horse and saddle. That foreman job, it is my chance to build something, to become someone who could actually provide for a wife, for a family." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am not proposing, understand. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I wanted you to know what is in my heart and why I have to go." She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "What if I do not want you to provide for me? What if I can provide for myself?" "I know you can. You have proven that, but I need to prove it to myself too. Need to know I am more than just a hired hand with a good seat on a horse." He released her hand and stood, moving to the window where the snow was still falling beyond the glass. "My father died broke, Laurel. Left my mother and all of us kids with nothing but debts and hard times. I swore I would never do that to my own family, that I would build something solid, something that could not be taken away." She understood, could hear the echo of her own father's failure in his words. They had both been shaped by loss, by the fear of being left with nothing. But where she had retreated into safety, accepting a quiet life in a remote town where expectations were lower, he was still striving, still reaching for something more. "When will you decide?" she asked. "I already have. I am taking the job." He turned back to face her, and the lamplight cast his face in harsh angles and shadows. "But I wanted to ask you something before I go. Would you write to me? After I leave, I mean. We could correspond like regular people do. I am not good enough to write long letters yet, but I am getting better and I would like to keep practicing. And I would like to hear from you, to know how you are doing." "Of course I will write to you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "As often as you like." "And maybe," he said, his voice tentative now, "maybe in a year or so, when I have the foreman job established and some money put by, maybe I could come back. To visit. To see if," he paused, searching for words, "to see if what is between us now is still there then." Laurel stood and crossed to where he stood by the window. She was not a tall woman, and she had to look up to meet his eyes. "It will still be there," she said with quiet certainty. "At least on my part. You cannot know that. A year is a long time. I know my own heart." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his jaw beneath her palm. "I care for you too, Harrison. These months have been the happiest I have known since coming west. The thought of you leaving feels like losing something precious." He caught her hand against his cheek, holding it there. "I do not want to lose this either, but I also do not want to stay here scraping by on ranch wages, knowing I could offer you more if I was just willing to work for it." "Then go," she said, though the words hurt to speak. "Take the job. Build your future. And write to me, and I will write to you, and when you come back in a year we will see where we stand. You would wait for me. I am not going anywhere. Animas Forks is my home now, for better or worse, and yes, I would wait for you." She smiled despite the tears that were now sliding down her cheeks. "You are worth waiting for, Harrison Lane." He pulled her into his arms then, a fierce embrace that spoke of desperation and longing and a tenderness she had not known she was capable of inspiring. She pressed her face against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart through the fabric of his shirt, and let herself, just for this moment, imagine a future where they did not have to say goodbye. When they finally pulled apart, his eyes were wet too, and he wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand. "I should go," he said. "Storm is getting worse and I need to get back to the ranch. Be careful. Always am." He gathered his things, shrugging into his heavy coat and settling his hat on his head. At the door, he turned back to look at her. "We have 2 more weeks before Christmas. I will be back for my lessons every evening we planned, if that is all right with you. I will be counting the hours." He smiled at that, a smile that transformed his face and made him look young and unguarded. "So will I." The days until Christmas passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Harrison came for his lessons as promised, and they made the most of their remaining time together, reading and talking late into the night, stealing moments of physical closeness that never crossed the line of propriety but hinted at the passion beneath. He kissed her on Christmas Eve, a gentle kiss full of promise and regret, and she gave him a gift she had spent weeks preparing. A leather-bound journal with his initials stamped on the cover, the pages blank and waiting for the words he would write. "For your thoughts," she said as he ran his fingers over the smooth leather, "and for practicing your letters, and so you do not forget me when you are down in Durango building your empire." "I could never forget you," he said, and kissed her again. He left Animas Forks on a cold morning in late April, when the snow was finally melting from the high passes and travel was possible again. Laurel stood outside the store and watched him ride away, his belongings packed on a mule behind his horse, and felt as though part of herself was riding away with him. The town seemed emptier without him, the days longer and more tedious, and she threw herself into work to distract from the ache of his absence. True to his word, he wrote to her. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after he left, and she recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful formation of letters she had taught him. The spelling was still imperfect, some words phonetic approximations rather than correct, but she could hear his voice in every line, and she read the letter so many times she could recite it from memory. He wrote about the journey to Durango, about the ranch where he was now foreman, about the work of managing 30 men and several thousand head of cattle across land that stretched farther than he could ride in a day. He wrote about his cabin, small but his own, with a window that looked toward the mountains. And he wrote about missing her, about thinking of her in the evenings when the work was done, and he was alone with his journal and his thoughts. She wrote back immediately, long letters full of news from Animas Forks, about the store and the people who came through and the harsh winter that had finally given way to spring. She told him about the wildflowers that were beginning to bloom on the hillsides, about her uncle who had written from Denver saying he had found work as a clerk, about the new family that had moved into the empty cabin on the edge of town. And she told him she missed him, that she thought of him often, that she was proud of him for taking the risk and chasing his dream. The correspondence continued through the spring and into summer. His letters grew longer and more confident as his writing improved, and she could track his progress not just in literacy, but in life. He wrote about the challenges of the foreman job, the difficult decisions he had to make, the satisfaction of seeing the ranch prosper under his management. He wrote about saving his wages, about his plans to buy land of his own eventually, about the future he was building. Summer in Animas Forks was brief and beautiful, the high meadows bursting with flowers, the streams running cold and clear with snowmelt. Laurel kept the store running efficiently, earning a reputation for fair dealing and sharp business sense. She hired a boy to help with the heavy work and expanded the stock to include more items the mining families needed. She was, by any measure, successful and independent. But in the quiet evenings, reading Harrison's letters by lamplight, she felt the loneliness of her situation keenly. She had other suitors, of course. The town was full of lonely men, and more than one miner or merchant had expressed interest in the pretty storekeeper with the quick mind and capable hands. She turned them all down gently but firmly, and if people talked about her waiting for the cowboy who had gone to Durango, she did not care. Let them talk. She knew her own heart, and it belonged to Harrison Lane, even if he was 200 miles away. Fall came again, the aspens turning gold, and with it came a letter that made her heart sink. Harrison wrote that the ranch owner had offered him a partnership, a chance to become part owner of the operation in exchange for investing his savings. It was an incredible opportunity, he wrote, the kind of thing he had only dreamed about. But it would mean staying in Durango longer, delaying his return to Animas Forks, possibly for another year or more while he established himself as a partner and built up his share of the business. He wrote that he would understand if she could not wait that long, that it was unfair of him to expect her to put her life on hold while he pursued his ambitions. But he also wrote that he loved her, the first time he had used that word in his letters, and that he hoped she could be patient just a little longer, that the future he was building was one he wanted to share with her. Laurel sat with that letter for a long time, reading and rereading the words until they blurred on the page. She thought about the year that had passed, about the months of waiting and wondering. She thought about the life she had built in Animas Forks, solid and secure, but ultimately solitary. And she thought about Harrison, about the man he had been when she met him and the man he was becoming, about the hours they had spent together by lamplight and the way he had looked at her when he said goodbye. The decision, when it came, was easier than she expected. She sat down at her desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. She told him she loved him too, had loved him for longer than she had been willing to admit. She told him to take the partnership, to build the future he dreamed of, because she believed in him and in what he could achieve. She told him she would wait as long as it took, that some things were worth waiting for, and that he was one of them. And she told him not to feel guilty or rushed, that she had her own life and work to keep her busy, and that when he finally came back to her, it would be because he was ready, not because she had forced his hand. The reply came faster than she expected, as though he had written back the moment he received her letter. The relief and joy in his words were palpable, and he wrote that her faith in him meant more than any business partnership or financial success. He promised to work as hard as he could to make himself worthy of her trust, and he vowed that he would return to Animas Forks as soon as he was able, that nothing would keep him away forever. The second year of their separation was harder than the first in some ways, easier in others. Harder because the longing had deepened into something more profound, a constant ache that no amount of work or distraction could fully ease. Easier because they had both committed to the waiting, had made a choice to trust in what they felt and to believe that the future would bring them back together. Laurel read his letters religiously, hoarding each one like treasure, and she wrote to him every week without fail. They shared their daily lives through these letters, the small triumphs and setbacks, the observations and thoughts that filled their days. He sent her pressed flowers from the ranch, and she sent him news clippings about Colorado that she thought might interest him. They were building something through their correspondence, a foundation of trust and understanding that went deeper than physical attraction or the romance of those first intense months. Christmas of that second year was bittersweet. Laurel decorated the store with pine boughs and tried to feel festive, but she could not help remembering the previous Christmas, the last one she had spent with Harrison before he left. She had grown close to some of the families in town, and they invited her to share their celebrations, but she felt like an outsider looking in, watching other people's happiness from a distance. On Christmas morning, a package arrived for her, brought by a traveler who had come up from Durango. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, soft and expertly made, and a note in Harrison's handwriting. "To keep your hands warm when you are reading my letters. I am working on coming home to you. Be patient with me just a little longer." She held the gloves to her face and breathed in the scent of the leather and felt tears sting her eyes. Be patient. She could do that. She had done it this long. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year, the snow lingering late into April. When it finally melted and the roads became passable again, Laurel found herself watching the stage with renewed hope every time it arrived, though she knew it was foolish. He had said it would take time, possibly another year. She could not expect him to suddenly appear just because she wanted him to. But hope was a stubborn thing, and it grew stronger as May turned into June and the high country burst into its brief, glorious summer. She kept the store running, kept writing her letters, kept believing that someday soon the waiting would be over. The letter came in mid-July, carried by the regular mail. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope and tore it open eagerly, hungry for news. But as she read, her hands began to shake. He was coming. Not someday in the distant future, but soon. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, as soon as he could arrange his affairs and make the journey. The partnership was established, the ranch was thriving, and he had saved enough money to feel secure. He was ready to come home, ready to see her, ready to start the life they had been planning through their letters. And there was more. At the end of the letter, written in careful, deliberate script, he had asked her to marry him. He wrote that he knew it was not the most romantic proposal, made through a letter rather than in person, but he could not wait any longer to ask. He wanted her to be his wife, wanted to build a life with her, wanted to wake up every morning knowing she was beside him. If she felt the same, if she would have him, he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted saying yes. Laurel read the proposal 3 times, her vision blurred with tears, and then she sat down and wrote the fastest letter of her life. Yes, she wrote. Yes to everything. Yes, she would marry him. Yes, she had been waiting for him. Yes, she loved him more than she had known it was possible to love someone. Just come home, she wrote. Come home and we will figure out the rest together. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of her life. She told no one about the proposal, hoarding the secret like a miser, but she could not quite hide her excitement. People commented that she seemed different, happier, more energized. She just smiled and said it was the good weather, the successful season at the store, anything but the truth. She cleaned her rooms above the store, bought fabric and began sewing a new dress, imagined 100 different scenarios of his arrival. Would he come during the day or evening? Would he come straight to the store or get a room first and clean up? Would he sweep her into his arms the moment he saw her? Or would they be awkward after so long apart in the end? It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late July when the sun was hot and the dust hung thick in the street. She was behind the counter, helping a customer select fabric when the door opened and Harrison walked in. She knew him instantly, despite the changes 2 years had wrought. He was still tall and lean, still moved with that easy confidence, but he carried himself differently now, with a kind of assurance that spoke of success and authority. He wore better clothes than she remembered, a clean shirt and vest, new boots, and his hat was high-quality felt rather than the battered thing he had worn before. But his eyes were the same, those steady gray eyes that had watched her so intently during their lessons, and when they met hers across the store she felt everything else fall away. "Harrison," she breathed. He crossed the store in quick strides, not running but moving with purpose, and before she could say anything else he had pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that felt like coming home. She buried her face in his shoulder and felt 2 years of longing and waiting dissolve into pure joy. "I am sorry," he said against her hair. "I am sorry it took so long. I am sorry for making you wait, but I am here now and I am never leaving you again." "You came back," she said, pulling back just enough to look at his face to reassure herself that he was real and solid and actually standing in front of her. "You really came back. Did you doubt it?" "No. But hoping and knowing are different things." He cupped her face in his hands, those scarred, capable hands that had learned to write letters to her, and looked at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch. "I love you, Laurel Brennan. I have loved you since you first offered to teach me to read, maybe before that. And I am asking you now, in person like I should have done from the start, will you marry me?" She laughed through her tears. "I already said yes in my letter. I want to hear you say it now, while I am looking at you, while I can see your face." "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a promise, like an oath. "Yes, I will marry you, today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Just do not leave again. I am not going anywhere without you." He kissed her then, a kiss that was nothing like the gentle, tentative one they had shared on Christmas Eve 2 years ago. This kiss was deep and thorough and full of promise, and it left her dizzy and breathless when they finally broke apart. It was only then that she remembered they had an audience. The customer she had been helping was staring with wide eyes, and through the window she could see several people had stopped in the street to watch. Her face flamed red, but Harrison just laughed, a sound of pure happiness that made her heart soar. "Guess everyone in Animas Forks will know by supper time," he said. "Let them know. I do not care. Neither do I." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Do you have someone who can watch the store for a bit? We have a lot to talk about." She called for the boy who helped with deliveries, gave him quick instructions to mind the counter, and then led Harrison upstairs to her rooms. It felt scandalous to be alone with him in her private space, but they were engaged now, and besides, they had earned the right to a private conversation after 2 years of separation. He looked around the small apartment, taking in the neat furnishings, the books on the shelves, the wildflowers she had arranged in a jar on the table. "This is nice," he said. "Homey. It has served me well, but it is small." She felt suddenly nervous, uncertain what to say to him now that they were alone. So much had passed between them, but it had all been through letters, and she found she did not know quite how to bridge the gap between the woman who wrote those letters and the woman standing before him now. He seemed to sense her uncertainty because he reached out and drew her close again, more gently this time. "I know this is strange," he said. 2 years is a long time. We need to get to know each other again." "Did you change very much?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "I think so. I hope so. I am more sure of myself now, more confident in what I can offer. But the important things, the things I feel for you, those have not changed. If anything, they have gotten stronger. I feel the same." She pulled back to look up at him. "Tell me about the ranch. About the partnership. I want to know everything." They sat at her small table, and he told her about the past 2 years in detail. About learning to manage the ranch. About earning the respect of the men who worked under him. About the hard decisions he had to make, and the satisfaction of seeing his choices bear fruit. He told her about becoming a partner, about what that meant for his future, and about the plans he had made for their life together. "The ranch is doing well," he said. "Well enough that I could buy out a larger share if I wanted. But I have been thinking about what you said, about how you have your own life here, your own business. I do not want to ask you to give that up. What are you suggesting? That we figure it out together. Maybe we live in Durango part of the year and here part of the year. Maybe you keep the store and hire someone to run it when we are gone. Maybe we sell the store and start something new in Durango. I do not have all the answers, Laurel. But I know I want us to decide together, as partners." She felt a rush of love for him so strong it was almost painful. He had come back not just with success and financial security, but with a willingness to compromise, to build a life that worked for both of them rather than expecting her to simply fit into his plans. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to spend most of our time in Durango. The ranch is your dream, and I want to be part of that. But I would also like to keep the store, maybe come back for the summers when the high country is beautiful. This place has been good to me, and I am not ready to give it up entirely." "That sounds like a good compromise." "You would not mind the traveling, mind getting to spend every season with you. I think I can manage." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to get married soon, Laurel. I do not want to wait any longer than we have to." "How soon?" "This week if possible." "I know that is fast, but we have been engaged in spirit for almost 2 years now. Seems like we have waited long enough." She laughed. "This week might be difficult. There are arrangements to make, people to invite." "Do we need all that? Can we not just go to the preacher and make it official?" "I suppose we could." She considered it, feeling excitement build. "Yes, why not? We have never done anything the conventional way. Why start now?" They were married 3 days later on a Friday afternoon with the summer sun streaming through the windows of the small church at the edge of town. Laurel wore the dress she had been sewing, simple but pretty, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Harrison wore his best suit, and he looked at her as she walked toward him with such naked adoration that several women in the audience started crying. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Harrison kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak, and the small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the wedding broke into applause. They held a small celebration at the boarding house afterward, Mrs. Henderson having offered her dining room for the occasion. There was cake and coffee, and people gave toasts wishing them happiness. Laurel looked around at the faces of the people she had come to know over her years in Animas Forks, and she felt a swell of gratitude for the community that had become her home. But she was also eager for the celebration to end, eager to begin her life with Harrison in earnest. When they finally made their excuses and left, walking through the dusty streets in the warm evening air, she felt like she was floating. Harrison had taken a room at the boarding house, and they went there now. climbing the narrow stairs with a sense of anticipation that made her pulse race. It was their wedding night, and while she was not entirely ignorant of what that meant, she was nervous nonetheless. He seemed to sense her anxiety, because once they were alone in the room he did not immediately reach for her. Instead, he lit the lamp and drew her to sit beside him on the edge of the bed. "We do not have to rush," he said quietly. "I know this is all very sudden, even though we have known each other for years. I want you to feel comfortable." "I am nervous," she admitted, "but not afraid, not with you." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. "I love you," he said between kisses. "I will never hurt you, never do anything you do not want. I know." She turned her face to catch his lips with hers, and the kiss deepened, grew more urgent. "I want this, Harrison, I want you. I have wanted this for so long." What followed was tender and careful, Harrison taking his time, making sure she was comfortable, showing her with his actions how precious she was to him. Afterward, lying in his arms with the lamplight casting soft shadows on the walls, Laurel felt a sense of completion she had not known she was missing. This was what she had been waiting for, not just the physical intimacy but the emotional connection, the sense of belonging to someone and having them belong to her. "What are you thinking?" Harrison asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "That I am happy. Happier than I have been in years, maybe ever." "Me too." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I keep thinking about the first time I came to the store for my letters. If someone had told me then that I would end up married to the beautiful woman behind the counter, I would have thought they were crazy." "Why is that?" "Because you were so far above me. Educated, refined, from a good family. I was just a ranch hand who could not even read his own name." "You were never just anything," she said fiercely. "You were kind and hardworking and determined to better yourself. That is what I fell in love with, not your education or social standing. I know that now, but it took me a while to believe I could deserve you." "We deserve each other," she corrected. "We are partners, equals. That is how this works." He pulled her closer, and they lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night. Eventually, Laurel asked the question that had been on her mind since he arrived. "When do we leave for Durango?" "Whenever you are ready. I can take a few weeks if you need time to arrange things here." "I would like to stay through August," she said. "Get the store organized, hire someone reliable to manage it in my absence. Then we could travel to Durango in September when the weather is still good." "That sounds perfect." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I am excited for you to see the ranch, to see our home." "Our home," she repeated, testing the words. They felt right, natural. "Tell me more about it, I want to picture it." He described the ranch in detail. The house he had been living in as foreman, which would be theirs now. The vast expanse of land where cattle grazed, the mountains rising in the distance. He told her about the horses he had been training, about the small garden he had started behind the house, about the creek that ran through the property where they could swim in the summer. As he talked, Laurel closed her eyes and let herself imagine it, this future they would build together. She saw herself in the garden, planting vegetables and flowers. She saw them riding together across the open land, Harrison teaching her the things he knew about ranching the way she had taught him to read. She saw children maybe in a few years, little ones learning their letters at the kitchen table while their father looked on with pride. The vision was so vivid, so full of possibility, that she felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she had been waiting for, what she had hoped for during all those months of separation. Not just love, but partnership. Not just romance, but a real life built together. The month they spent in Animas Forks after the wedding was sweet and strange, existing in a kind of liminal space between her old life and her new one. Laurel continued to run the store during the days, but now Harrison was there beside her, helping with the heavy work, charming customers with his quiet competence. In the evenings, they would close up and retreat to her rooms, and she would teach him more advanced reading, introducing him to poetry and philosophy, delighting in his growing confidence with language. They also used the time to plan for their future. Laurel interviewed several candidates to manage the store in her absence, and eventually hired a widow named Sarah Collins, who had experience keeping books and a good head for business. They went through the inventory together, Laurel explaining her systems and procedures, making sure Sarah understood how things should be run. Harrison, meanwhile, made arrangements for their travel, purchasing a sturdy wagon and team to carry Laurel's belongings, selling his old horse and buying a new mare that would be suitable for her to ride. He wrote to the ranch to let them know when he would be returning, and that he was bringing a wife, and the letters that came back were warm with congratulations and welcomes. As August drew to a close and their departure grew near, Laurel felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. She had spent 2 years in Animas Forks, and while it had not been an easy time, it had shaped her in important ways. She had learned self-reliance and business acumen, had proven to herself that she could survive on her own. And she had met Harrison here, had taught him to read by lamplight and fallen in love in the process. This town would always hold a special place in her heart. On their last evening they walked through the streets together, hand in hand, saying goodbye to the people they had come to know. Mrs. Henderson hugged Laurel tight and made her promise to write. The marshal shook Harrison's hand and wished them well. Even the roughest miners tipped their hats and offered gruff congratulations as they passed. When they finally returned to the store, now dark and closed for the night, Laurel paused in the doorway and looked back at the main room where she had spent so many hours. This was where it had all begun, where Harrison had come to collect his letters and admitted he could not read them. This was where they had sat by lamplight, his head bent over the primer, her voice patient as she taught him each word. This was where they had fallen in love, slowly and carefully, building something that had lasted through separation and doubt. "Thank you," she said softly. Harrison, who had been waiting on the stairs, came back down to stand beside her. "For what?" "For trusting me enough to ask for help, for working so hard to learn, for coming back like you promised." He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head. "I should be thanking you. You changed my life, Laurel, gave me something I did not even know I was missing." "We changed each other's lives," she said. "That is what love does." They left Animas Forks the next morning, the wagon loaded with Laurel's belongings, the new mare tied behind. The sun was just rising over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Laurel sat beside Harrison on the wagon seat, her hand resting on his thigh, and watched the town grow smaller behind them until it disappeared around a bend in the road. The journey to Durango took 8 days, following rough roads that wound through mountain passes and high valleys. They camped at night under the stars, Harrison teaching Laurel how to build a proper fire and cook over open flames, Laurel reading aloud from books they had brought while he listened with his head in her lap. It was a journey that felt almost like a honeymoon, just the two of them and the vast landscape. And by the time they reached Durango, Laurel felt completely at ease in her new role as Harrison's wife. The ranch was everything he had described and more. The house was a solid log structure with a wide porch and large windows that let in the afternoon light. The land stretched in all directions, golden grass waving in the breeze, and in the distance, the mountains rose like sentinels. It was beautiful in a way that was completely different from Animas Forks, less dramatic but more open, and Laurel felt something in her chest expand at the sight of so much space. The men who worked the ranch were curious about her, this educated woman from the East who had married their foreman. But Harrison introduced her with such obvious pride that they accepted her quickly. The ranch owner, a gruff but kind man named Mr. Patterson, welcomed her warmly and made it clear that she was part of the family now, that her opinions and ideas would be valued. Laurel threw herself into life on the ranch with the same energy she had brought to running the store. She learned to ride properly, not the side saddle style she had been taught as a girl, but the practical way that allowed her to actually control a horse. She helped with the garden and the chickens, learned to cook for large groups when the men came in for meals, and started teaching reading and writing to several of the ranch hands who, like Harrison, had never learned. Harrison, watching her adapt and thrive, fell even more deeply in love. She was not some fragile city woman who needed to be coddled and protected. She was strong and capable and willing to work hard, and she brought a warmth to the ranch that had been missing before. The men adored her, and more than once Harrison found himself fiercely protective when one of them looked at her too long or laughed too hard at her jokes. "They are harmless," she told him one evening when she caught him scowling at a young cowboy who had been helping her hang laundry. "I know. But you are mine, and I do not like other men looking at you like that." "Like what?" "Like you hung the moon." She laughed and kissed him. "You are ridiculous, and I love you." That first fall on the ranch was busy with the work of preparing for winter, rounding up cattle, and making sure everything was secure before the snows came. Laurel helped where she could, and spent her free time making the house truly theirs, adding curtains and rugs, creating a library with the books they had accumulated, setting up a proper desk where they could both work on correspondence and accounts. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, and sometimes Harrison would read aloud, his voice steady and confident now, stumbling only occasionally over difficult words. Laurel would listen with her mending in her lap, and she would feel such a swell of pride at how far he had come. This man who had been ashamed to admit he could not read and now devoured books with the hunger of someone making up for lost time. Winter came, and with it a slower pace. The ranch work continued but with less urgency, and they had more time to themselves. It was during these quiet months that Laurel discovered she was pregnant, and when she told Harrison, he looked at her with such joy and wonder that she started crying. "A baby," he said, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Happy does not even begin to cover it. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "You have given me everything, Laurel. A reason to learn, a home, and now a family. I do not know what I did to deserve you. You were yourself," she said simply. That was enough. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as Laurel's belly grew round, she found herself thinking often about her mother and sisters back in Boston. She wrote to them regularly, telling them about her life on the ranch, about Harrison and the baby that was coming. Her mother wrote back with advice and well wishes, and her sisters sent small gifts for the baby, knitted blankets and tiny clothes. In late May, when the wildflowers were blooming and the air was sweet with new grass, Laurel went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Harrison stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her brow and telling her she was strong. She could do this. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly well, Laurel wept with relief and exhaustion. They named him Samuel, after Laurel's uncle who had brought her to Colorado and thus inadvertently brought her to Harrison. The baby was a good-natured child who rarely cried, and Harrison proved to be a natural father, confident and gentle despite having no experience. Laurel would often find him in the evenings, sitting in the rocking chair with Samuel in his arms, reading aloud from whatever book he was currently working through, and the sight never failed to make her heart swell. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered under Harrison's management, and within 3 years he was able to buy out a larger share of the partnership, making him nearly an equal owner with Mr. Patterson. They talked about eventually buying their own land, starting their own operation, but there was no rush. They were happy where they were, part of a community that valued them. Laurel made good on her plan to return to Animas Forks each summer, bringing Samuel with her, and later, when he was 3, his baby sister Martha, named for Harrison's sister in Kansas. They would spend June through August in the high country, Laurel overseeing the store and reconnecting with old friends while Harrison helped with work on the nearby ranches. It was the best of both worlds, the excitement of the mining town and the peaceful stability of the ranch, and their children grew up knowing both places as home. Harrison's reading and writing continued to improve until no one would have guessed he had once been illiterate. He read constantly, everything from dime novels to agricultural journals to the classics Laurel recommended, and he began writing more than just letters. He kept a journal, recording daily observations about the ranch and the weather and his children's milestones. And sometimes, late at night, he would write stories, simple tales about cowboys and cattle drives that made Laurel laugh and cry in equal measure. "You should try to publish these," she told him one evening after reading a particularly moving story about an old cowboy teaching a young one the ways of the range. "They are not good enough for that. They are. You have a gift for capturing the truth of this life. People would want to read that." He looked doubtful but pleased, and a few weeks later she caught him revising one of the stories, carefully choosing better words, tightening the narrative. She said nothing, just smiled to herself and let him work. Martha Lang, Harrison's sister from Kansas, finally came to visit when Samuel was 5 and Martha was 2. She arrived on the train with her 3 children, excited to finally meet the woman who had taught her brother to read and then married him. The 2 women liked each other immediately, Martha's warm practicality meshing well with Laurel's quiet strength, and they spent hours talking while Harrison played with his nieces and nephews. "I am so grateful to you," Martha told Laurel one evening after the children were in bed. "Harry was always so ashamed that he could not read. It ate at him, even though he tried to hide it. But you gave him that gift and it changed everything for him." "He did the work himself," Laurel said. "I just showed him how. It was more than that, and you know it. You believed in him." That is what made the difference. Laurel thought about that later, lying in bed beside Harrison with his arm around her and the moonlight streaming through the window. She supposed Martha was right. Belief was powerful, maybe more powerful than technique or instruction. Harrison had needed someone to believe he could learn, and she had offered that belief without reservation or judgment. But he had also believed in her, she realized. Had believed she was strong enough to wait for him, had believed she would be happy on the ranch despite being raised in the city, had believed she could adapt and thrive in this hard country. Their love had been built on mutual faith, each of them seeing the best in the other and holding fast to that vision even when doubt threatened. The years passed with the steady accumulation of small joys and occasional sorrows. Mr. Patterson died when Samuel was 7, and Harrison bought out his share of the ranch from his widow, finally becoming the sole owner. It was a bittersweet moment, mourning the loss of a mentor while celebrating the achievement of a dream. They renamed it the Lang Ranch, and Harrison had a sign made and mounted over the gate, his name spelled out in iron letters that would last for generations. Laurel's uncle Samuel died that same year, leaving her a small inheritance that she used to expand the store in Animas Forks, adding a second room and increasing the inventory. Sarah Collins had managed it well in the years since Laurel had left, and they had developed an easy partnership, Sarah running things during the winter and Laurel taking over in summer. It was a good arrangement, profitable and satisfying, and Laurel liked knowing she had her own enterprise, something that was hers apart from the ranch. They had 2 more children, another boy and another girl, and the house rang with the noise and chaos of a large family. Harrison proved to be a patient and loving father, teaching his sons to ride and rope and work cattle, teaching his daughters to read before they were old enough for school, passing on the gift that Laurel had given him. All 4 children learned their letters early and grew up with books as common as bread, and Laurel felt deep satisfaction knowing they would never struggle the way their father had. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison presented Laurel with a gift that made her cry. It was a book, leather-bound and beautiful, and when she opened it, she found it was full of his writing. He had compiled all the stories he had written over the years, revised and polished them until they shone, and had them professionally printed and bound. "For you," he said as she paged through it with trembling hands, "because none of this would exist without you. The stories, the writing, any of it. You taught me every word by lamplight, and this is what came from those lessons." She could not speak, could only pull him close and hold him while tears streamed down her face. Later that night, after the children were asleep, she read through the entire book, and she was struck by the beauty and truth in his words. He had captured the essence of ranch life, the hard work and the rewards, the relationship between man and land and animal. It was rough in places, unpolished by literary standards, but it was authentic and moving in a way that more sophisticated writing sometimes was not. "You should really try to publish this," she said again. And this time he did not argue. It took another year of sending manuscripts and receiving rejections, but finally a publisher in Denver agreed to print a small run of Harrison's stories. The book did not become a bestseller, but it sold respectably well, especially in Colorado and Wyoming, where people recognized the truth in his descriptions. He received letters from readers, other cowboys and ranchers who said he had gotten it right, that he understood the life in a way city writers never did. Harrison was quietly proud of this success, though he never stopped thinking of himself primarily as a rancher. The writing was something he did in his spare time, for the love of it, and that made it pure in a way professional writing might not have been. As their children grew and became more independent, Harrison and Laurel found themselves with time to rediscover each other. They would take long rides together across the ranch land, just the 2 of them, and they would talk about everything and nothing, comfortable in the way of people who had spent years learning each other's minds. Sometimes they would make love in the afternoon, sneaking away while the children were occupied, and the passion between them had not dimmed with time, but had deepened into something richer and more complex. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked one afternoon as they lay in the grass beside a creek, watching clouds drift by overhead. "Leaving Boston, coming to Colorado, marrying me." "Never," she said without hesitation. "My life here is so much fuller than anything I could have had there. I have work I love, a family I adore, and you, always you. I used to worry I had trapped you, that you stayed in Animas Forks and then married me because you felt obligated somehow. That is ridiculous. I stayed because I fell in love with you. I married you because I could not imagine my life without you." She rolled onto her side to look at him. "Do you regret it? Taking so long to come back, making me wait?" I regret the time we lost. But I do not regret building something first, making sure I had something to offer. I think it would have been harder if I had come back broke and desperate, asking you to take a chance on me with nothing to show but good intentions. I would have taken that chance. I know. But I would have always wondered if you deserved better. This way, I know I earned you. She kissed him, slow and deep, tasting the sun and grass on his lips. You did not have to earn me, Harrison. I was yours from the moment you trusted me enough to admit you could not raid. That vulnerability, that willingness to accept help, that is what made me fall in love with you. When Samuel was 12 and talking about going to college back east someday, Laurel realized with a start that she had now lived in Colorado for over 15 years, longer than she had lived in Boston. Her mother had died 2 years before, peacefully in her sleep, and her sisters had moved on with their lives, their correspondence growing less frequent as the years passed, and they had less in common. Colorado was her home now, fully and completely, and she could not imagine living anywhere else. The store in Animas Forks was sold when Sarah Collins decided to retire, and while Laurel felt a pang at letting it go, she also felt relief. She had other things to occupy her time now: the ranch and the children and a new project she had started, teaching reading to adults in the area who had never learned. It had started with just a few ranch hands but had grown into a formal program. And once a week people would gather in the schoolhouse in the nearest town, and Laurel would lead them through lessons, passing on the gift she had given Harrison to others who needed it. Harrison supported this work fully, often coming with her to the evening classes, sitting in the back of the room and watching with pride as his wife taught others the way she had once taught him. Sometimes he would help, working one-on-one with students who were struggling, and Laurel loved watching him be patient with people the way she had been patient with him. "You are a good teacher," she told him after one session where he had spent an hour helping an elderly cowboy sound out words. "I had a good teacher myself," he replied. "I am just passing it on." Their own children thrived. Samuel did go east for college, studying agriculture so he could bring modern techniques back to the ranch. Martha married a local boy and settled nearby, giving them grandchildren whom Laurel adored. The 2 younger children were still at home, growing up strong and confident, and the house was still full of life and love, and the daily chaos of a working ranch. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Laurel back to Animas Forks, just the 2 of them, leaving the children with their eldest daughter. The town had not changed much, still clinging to the mountainside, still populated by miners and dreamers. They stayed at the boarding house where they had spent their wedding night, and they walked through the empty building that had once housed the store. "This is where it all started," Laurel said, standing in the middle of the dusty room. "Where you came for your letters and admitted you could not raid them." "Best thing I ever did, admitting that," Harrison said. "Hardest too, but the best." They found the back room where they had conducted the lessons, now empty of furniture but still recognizable. Laurel could almost see them as they had been, younger and unsure but hopeful, bent over books by lamplight, his finger tracing words while she corrected his pronunciation. It felt like a lifetime ago and also like yesterday. "I taught you every word by lamplight in this room," she said softly. "And you took those words and built a life with them. You wrote letters to your sister, kept journals, wrote stories that people read and loved. You used that gift, Harrison. We both did. You used the gift of teaching, and I used the gift of learning, and together we made something good." He pulled her close, there in the empty room full of ghosts and memories. "I love you, Laurel Lang. I have loved you for more than 20 years, and I will love you for 20 more and 20 after that. Promise. Promise." They left Animas Forks the next day, riding back to Durango and the ranch and the life they had built together. As they traveled, Laurel thought about the strange path that had brought her here, the way loss and necessity had driven her west, the way chance had brought Harrison into her store on that September afternoon so many years ago. She thought about the patient work of teaching him to read, the slow building of trust and affection that had grown into deep and abiding love. She thought about the years of separation and reunion, the marriage and children, and all the small accumulations that made a life. And she thought about words, those symbols on a page that had seemed so insignificant but had changed everything. Teaching Harrison to read had given him access to knowledge and self-expression, had allowed him to write to his sister and keep journals and eventually craft stories that moved people. But it had also given them to each other, creating a bond that had lasted through time and distance, and all the challenges life had thrown at them. Words, she realized, were more than just tools for communication. They were bridges between people, ways of reaching across the distances that separated one heart from another. She had taught Harrison every word by Lamplight, but he had taught her something too. That love was patient and persistent, that it could grow in unexpected places, that it was worth waiting for and working toward. The ranch appeared on the horizon, the house with its wide porch and the mountains rising beyond, and Laurel felt her heart lift with the familiar joy of coming home. Their children would be waiting, probably with 100 questions and stories about what had happened while they were gone. There would be work to do, always work on a ranch, and meals to cook and books to read and letters to write. There would be laughter and arguments and the ordinary friction of family life. And through it all there would be Harrison, her partner in love, the cowboy who had learned to read by lamplight and in the process had stolen her heart completely. As they rode up to the house, and their children came spilling out onto the porch, calling greetings and waving, Laurel reached over and squeezed Harrison's hand. He squeezed back, and they shared a look that spoke of everything they had built together, everything they had overcome, everything they still had to look forward to. It was a good life, she thought. An unexpected life, shaped by choices she never could have predicted when she left Boston all those years ago. But it was hers, truly and completely hers, and she would not trade it for anything. That evening, after supper was done and the dishes were washed, and the children were finally settled for the night, Laurel and Harrison sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one in the vast Colorado sky. He had a book in his lap, something new he had ordered from a catalog, and she had her mending, and they sat in comfortable silence broken only by the occasional rustle of pages or the creak of the porch swing. "Read to me," she said eventually, setting aside her mending. He glanced at her with a smile, understanding what she meant. He opened the book and began to read aloud, his voice steady and confident, no longer stumbling over words or pronouncing them incorrectly. She closed her eyes and listened, and she remembered all those evenings years ago when his reading had been halting and uncertain, when every sentence was a struggle and every page a victory. They had come so far, both of them. From that first admission of illiteracy to this moment of easy companionship, from tentative affection to deep and lasting love, from two separate individuals to a partnership that had weathered every storm. The journey had not always been easy, but it had been worth every step. When Harrison finished the chapter and closed the book, she opened her eyes and found him watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her throat tight. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For everything. For teaching me to read, for waiting for me, for building this life with me. For every day of the past 20 years, and for every day that is still to come. "You do not need to thank me for loving you," she said. "That has always been the easiest thing in the world." He leaned over and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and she tasted happiness and contentment and the promise of years still ahead. When they finally went inside and climbed the stairs to their bedroom, she looked back at the porch where they had been sitting, at the lamp still burning on the table beside Harrison's book, and she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was her life. This was their life. Built word by word, lesson by lesson, from that first evening when she had offered to teach him to read, and he had accepted with fear and hope in equal measure. The lamplight that had illuminated those early lessons still burned, figuratively if not literally, guiding them through the years, showing them the way forward. And as she lay down beside her husband and felt his arms come around her in the dark, Laurel knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, that every choice and every chance had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this rich and full and unexpected life. They had started with words learned by lamplight, a cowboy and a teacher in a small back room in a mountain town. They had built from that foundation a marriage, a family, a legacy that would extend beyond their own lives into the generations that followed. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible when she left Boston, more than Harrison had dared hope for when he first admitted he could not read. But they had dared together, had taken chances and made choices that seemed impossible at the time, and they had won something precious, a love that lasted, a life well lived, and the knowledge that they had made each other better than they could have been alone. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Outside, the Colorado night stretched vast and star-filled over the ranch, over the mountains, over the wild country that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately given them to each other. And inside, in the house they had made a home, Harrison and Laurel Lang slept peacefully, their hands joined even in sleep, two people who had found each other against all odds and had never let go. The lamplight that had brought them together still burned in their hearts, steady and true, guiding them through all the days of their lives, a testament to the power of patience and faith and love. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains and a new day began, they would wake together and continue the life they had built, word by word, day by day, forever.